The barrel of the French musket shook in the hands of the French rifleman as he watched the rocky cliffs that rose like threatening giants on both sides of the narrow pass. It was April 17, 1811, and something in the silence of that morning in the Spanish countryside warned of death. The boots of the French column echoed against the rocky road, a steady rhythm that had accompanied the soldiers during 3 hours of marching from the town of Narada. Captain Henry Dubois rode at the front of the 200 riflemen of the 47th Line Regiment with the typical pride of someone who'd marched victoriously from Paris to Madrid. His dark blue uniform, decorated with golden stripes, shined under the morning sun, which was barely beginning to warm the heights of the Guadarrama Mountains. Dubois did not imagine that in less than 2 hours that same uniform would be stained with his own blood. Among the rocks, invisible to the French, Miguel pressed his blunderbuss against his chest. The Spanish guerrilla fighter had spent the entire night in that position without moving, waiting for the signal from Juan Martín Díaz, known throughout Castile as El Empecinado. Miguel could feel the cold of the stone going through his worn brown jacket, but the hatred toward the French invaders burned stronger than any temperature. He had seen Napoleon's soldiers burn his village, rape the women, and execute his father for refusing to reveal where they hid the grain. The trap was perfectly prepared. El Empecinado had chosen this narrow pass after 3 days of careful observation. The terrain was ideal. Rocky walls 15 meters high on both sides, a narrow road that barely allowed marching in a formation of 4 men across, and a sharp curve that prevented the French from seeing what waited for them ahead. 150 Spanish guerrilla fighters occupied strategic positions in the heights, each one armed with blunderbusses, old captured British muskets, and the fierce determination of those who defend their homeland. But to understand how they arrived at this crucial moment, we must go back 3 years in time to that fateful May 2nd, 1808, when the people of Madrid rose up against the French troops that occupied the Spanish capital. That day marked the beginning of a war that would completely transform the way of fighting in Europe. The Spanish, outnumbered and outgunned by the most powerful army on the continent, discovered that war was not won only on open battlefields with regular formations. The French invasion of Spain had begun under the excuse of attacking Portugal, an ally of England. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France and conqueror of half of Europe, sent his troops across the Pyrenees in 1807 with the supposed mission of crossing Spain peacefully, but the true intentions of the Corsican emperor were very different. He wanted to place his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, removing the Bourbon royal family. The Spanish population reacted with fury to this betrayal. From Asturias to Andalusia, provincial councils declared war on the invader. But the regular Spanish army, although brave, had been scattered in the first major battles. The Spanish victory at Bayonne in July 1808 showed that the French could be defeated, but it was not enough. Napoleon himself crossed the Pyrenees with the Grande Armée and crushed the organized resistance in a few weeks. Then something completely unexpected by the French military strategists emerged: guerrilla warfare. Peasants, monks, craftsmen, and former soldiers formed irregular groups that began to attack French columns, supply convoys, messengers, and isolated garrisons. They did not wear recognizable uniforms, did not follow the conventional rules of war, and knew every corner of their territory. For the French, accustomed to field battles decided in hours with ordered formations, this new form of war was confusing and terrifying. Juan Martín Díaz had been a muleteer before the war, transporting goods across the difficult roads of Castile. He knew every path, every narrow pass, every cave in the region. When the French came to his village and took his mules, something broke inside him. He gathered 20 men and formed his first guerrilla group. 3 years later, El Empecinado commanded a force of more than 500 men and was considered by the French as one of the most dangerous insurgents in all of Spain. The forces present on that April 17 were unequal in appearance. The 200 French riflemen of Captain Dubois belonged to a veteran line regiment trained in the best European military methods. They carried Model 1777 muskets, 40-centimeter bayonets, and marched with the Prussian discipline that Napoleon had perfected. Each soldier carried 60 ammunition cartridges, a backpack with provisions for 3 days, and the confidence of belonging to the army that had conquered practically all of continental Europe. The Spanish guerrilla fighters, on contrast, looked like a mixed group without formal training. Their weapons were a chaotic mixture: short-barreled blunderbusses capable of firing anything metal, old hunting muskets, some shotguns, and even slings and knives. Their uniforms consisted of the clothes they wore when they left their villages: brown peasant jackets, wide-brim hats, patched rope sandals. But what they lacked in equipment they made up for with crucial advantages: perfect knowledge of the terrain, absolute motivation, and the ability to blend in with the landscape. What was about to happen in that narrow pass would change the French perception about the war in Spain and would demonstrate that technological superiority did not guarantee victory when the enemy chose when, where, and how to fight. 3 days before the ambush, El Empecinado had gathered his captains in a cave hidden among the pine trees of the mountains. On the dirt floor, using stones and branches, he built a model of the narrow pass where he planned to attack. The light of the torches threw dancing shadows on the rocky walls, while he explained every detail of his plan with the precision of an academic general, although he had never set foot in a military school. "The French are predictable," El Empecinado began, pointing at the model with a stick. His rough voice echoed in the cavern. "They always march in column along the main roads because they fear getting lost in our mountains. They always maintain the same formation. They always trust that their discipline will save them." His dark eyes shined with the intensity of someone who had studied the enemy for years. "But discipline is useless when bullets come from all directions and you cannot see who is shooting at you." Miguel, who had proven to be one of the most accurate shooters in the group, listened carefully. He was 24 years old, but the war had aged him prematurely. His weathered face showed scars from previous battles, including one that crossed his left eyebrow, a gift from a French saber in a close encounter from which he barely escaped with his life. "How many French do we expect?" he asked in a serious voice. "The scouts report a column of 200 riflemen," El Empecinado replied. "They leave from Madrid toward Segovia every week carrying messages and orders. It is a route they consider safe because we have never attacked them there." A cold smile appeared on his face, until now. He pointed to different positions on his improvised model. "We will place 50 men here on the western ridge, another 50 on the eastern one. The rest will stay hidden at the end of the narrow pass to close the trap." The preparation had been careful. During 2 nights, small groups of guerrilla fighters moved silently to their positions, carrying ammunition, water, and provisions. They built small stone walls that from below looked like natural rock formations. They calculated the shooting distances, identified escape routes, and established signals to coordinate the attack. Everything had to work perfectly because there would be no second chance. The conditions of the French troops marching toward the trap were very different from those they had enjoyed 3 years before. Captain Dubois commanded tired men, increasingly demoralized by a war that seemed to have no end. When they crossed the Pyrenees in 1808, the French soldiers sang victorious songs and dreamed of returning home soon, loaded with glory and spoils. Now in 1811, every patrol outside the main cities was a mortal risk. Lieutenant Pierre Moreau, second in command of the column, rode next to Dubois with a worried expression. He was a young officer of barely 22 years, son of a Parisian notary who had bought his commission with the hope that military service would open doors for his son in the imperial administration. "Mon capitaine," he said in a low voice so the soldiers would not hear him, "I do not like this road. The heights are perfect for an ambush." Dubois dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "The guerrillas are cowards, Pierre. They attack supply convoys and solitary messengers, not columns of 200 trained riflemen." His confidence was genuine, but mistaken, based on an incomplete understanding of irregular warfare. "Besides, we have taken all precautions. Scouts ahead, rear guard covered, and we maintain close formation." The French scouts, 5 light horsemen who rode 300 meters ahead of the main column, had passed through the narrow pass without detecting anything suspicious. The Spanish guerrilla fighters had remained completely motionless, not even breathing hard when the French horses passed within meters of their hiding places. It was a discipline that the French military would never have expected from disorganized peasants. The first contact was not violent, it was simply a moment when the French column entered completely into the death zone prepared by El Empecinado. The guerrilla leader watched from an elevated position, waiting for the perfect moment. He could see the blue snake of French uniforms extending along the narrow road, approximately 150 meters of total length. The vanguard had already reached the curve of the narrow pass. The rear guard was barely entering the beginning of the pass. Miguel felt sweat running down his back despite the morning cold. His finger rested lightly on the trigger of the blunderbuss, a short weapon but devastating at close distance. He had loaded the barrel with a lethal mixture: 3 musket balls, several pieces of irregular metal, and rusty nails. At 20 meters distance, that load could tear apart a man. The initial development of the encounter depended completely on the surprise factor. The French marched in a column formation of 4 men across with their muskets slung over their shoulders, totally inadequate for immediate combat. Changing to battle line formation in that narrow terrain would be practically impossible. Deploying shooters would require precious minutes that the guerrilla fighters would not give them. Francois, the rifleman who marched in the 5th row of the column, thought about his home in Normandy. He had not seen his wife and young son for 3 years. His son would now be 6 years old and probably would not recognize him. Letters arrived irregularly, when they arrived, because the Spanish guerrilla fighters killed the mail carriers with particular cruelty. The last news he had received 4 months ago reported that his son had become sick with fevers. Had he survived? The uncertainty tortured him more than hunger or tiredness. El Empecinado slowly raised his right arm. It was a signal that 150 pairs of eyes were waiting to see. Time seemed to stop. An eagle flew in a circle over the narrow pass, completely unaware of the human tragedy that was about to unfold. The wind gently moved the rosemary bushes that grew among the rocks. The sun shined with indifference over French and Spanish alike. Then El Empecinado lowered his arm sharply. The roar was deafening. 150 weapons fired simultaneously from the heights, turning the narrow pass into a hell of smoke, fire, and lead. The first volley fell upon the French like a divine hammer. Soldiers who, a second before, were marching thinking about their distant homes collapsed instantly. Some dead before hitting the ground, others screaming while blood gushed from horrible wounds. Francois felt something hot graze his left cheek. A piece of irregular metal fired from Miguel's blunderbuss had passed centimeters from his face and had impacted the neck of the soldier who marched at his side. Jean-Baptiste, an 18-year-old Breton peasant, fell grabbing his throat with both hands while life escaped between his fingers. His eyes, filled with terror and confusion, searched Francois's eyes as if asking for an explanation that no one could give. "Ambush! Fall line!" Captain Dubois shouted with his voice broken by urgency. But forming battle line on the road barely 4 meters wide, surrounded by rocky walls, was an impossible exercise. The French riflemen, trained for precise maneuvers in open fields, pushed each other while desperately trying to bring their muskets to firing position. The second volley arrived before the French could respond. The Spanish guerrilla fighters had prepared 2 weapons each. While some fired, others reloaded in a well-coordinated sequence. More soldiers fell. Lieutenant Moreau received an impact in his right shoulder that knocked him off his horse. The animal, maddened by the noise and the smell of blood, galloped toward the rear guard, trampling several soldiers in its flight. Miguel reloaded his blunderbuss with hands that trembled from adrenaline but remained steady from practice. He poured gunpowder from the horn into the barrel, pushed another handful of deadly metal, tamped it with the ramrod, prepared the percussion cam. The whole process took him 30 seconds. Meanwhile, he watched the chaos below. The French tried to fire toward the heights, but the smoke from their own muskets prevented them from seeing clear targets. El Empecinado moved among his positions with the calmness of a shepherd supervising his flock. "Controlled fire. Do not waste ammunition," he ordered. His strategy was perfect. Maintain constant but sustainable fire, force the French to remain in the narrow pass, and exhaust both their ammunition and their morale. He knew that Napoleon's soldiers carried 60 cartridges each, but firing upward against barely visible enemies would exhaust them quickly. The intensification of the combat arrived when the French tried to scale the walls of the narrow pass. Captain Dubois, demonstrating the courage that had taken him from private soldier to officer, personally led a group of 20 riflemen in a desperate assault against the western ridge. "Avec moi! To the bayonet!" he shouted while beginning to climb the rocky slope using ledges and bushes as support points. The Spanish guerrilla fighters waited until the French were halfway to the summit, completely exposed and vulnerable. Then they unleashed a rain of fire that swept away the attackers like leaves in a storm.
Dubois felt a brutal impact in his chest that threw him backward. He rolled down the slope, bouncing against rocks until he stopped on the road with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. He spit blood while trying to breathe. Each breath was indescribable agony. Francois had lost all notion of time. Had 5 minutes passed? 30? The combat had become a surreal nightmare where only the acrid smoke, the screams of the wounded, the constant roar of the shots, and the visceral fear that froze one's guts.
He had fired his musket 4 times toward the heights without knowing if he had hit anything. The bayonet fixed to the barrel of his weapon was stained with blood, although he did not remember having fought hand-to-hand with anyone. The tactics used by both sides reflected completely opposite military philosophies. The French tried to maintain their discipline and formation, trusting in training and European military doctrine. They sought to concentrate their fire, maintain order, and execute coordinated maneuvers. But all of that required space, visibility, and time. 3 things that the narrow pass did not offer. The Spanish guerrilla fighters, in contrast, fought in a completely decentralized way. Each man was responsible for his own sector, choosing targets, rate of fire, and position according to his judgment. There was no formation to maintain, no doctrine to follow. It was a primitive war in its execution, but sophisticated in its planning. El Empecinado had created the conditions for victory, but the battle itself was fought by individual men making individual decisions. A critical decision arrived when the most veteran French officer remaining standing, a sergeant major named Beaufort with 15 years of service, understood that staying in the narrow pass meant certain death. "Retreat! Organized retreat toward the south," he ordered with a voice that echoed over the chaos. The French began to fall back, maintaining formation as much as possible, with the soldiers of the rear guard firing to cover the movement. But El Empecinado had anticipated this maneuver. The 50 guerrilla fighters he had kept in reserve at the end of the narrow pass now revealed their position. They had built a barricade of stones and logs that completely blocked the road. Behind it, blunderbusses and muskets pointed toward the retreating French. The trap had closed completely. Before continuing with the decisive hours of this battle, and believe me, what happened next changed the course of the entire war in this region, we want to know from which city or country you are watching us. Write it in the comments. If you want more detailed war stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. A like helps these important historical events reach more people. Now let's go back to that fateful moment. The immediate consequence of discovering the barricade was a panic that began to spread among the French ranks. Sergeant Beaufort understood with horrible clarity that there was no easy escape. They were trapped in a rectangle of death 150 meters long by 4 meters wide, with enemies firing from 3 directions. The moment that completely changed the dynamics of the combat arrived when Francois made a decision that only a desperate man would make. Watching the corpses of his comrades piling up on the narrow road, he understood that the military discipline they had been taught with beatings in the training fields of France was useless in this situation. He threw off his backpack, which weighed more than 20 kilograms, and began to climb the eastern wall of the narrow pass without waiting for orders. 5 French soldiers instinctively followed him, recognizing that the only possibility of survival was to reach the heights and fight the guerrilla fighters on their own ground. Francois climbed with the strength that absolute terror gives. His fingers bled as they grabbed the sharp rocks, his boots slipped on the loose stone, but he continued climbing. A Spanish bullet passed whistling by his left ear. Another tore off a piece of rock right where his hand had been a second before. Miguel saw him coming and adjusted his aim. The Frenchman was 20 meters away vertically, moving quickly. The Spanish guerrilla fighter breathed deeply, exhaled half the air, and squeezed the trigger. The blunderbuss roared, but Francois had changed position at the last instant. The load passed, grazing him, and hit the soldier climbing behind him, who fell screaming until he crashed against the rocks of the road with a sickening sound. Francois's decisive action had a domino effect. More French soldiers began to climb at different points, transforming the combat from a one-sided shootout into a series of close and brutal encounters. Sergeant Beaufort, recognizing the opportunity, organized assault groups while maintaining a corps of riflemen on the road, providing covering fire. François reached the summit and ruled over it with his musket raised. He found himself face to face with a Spanish guerrilla fighter about 50 years old, face weathered by the sun and smallpox scars, who was trying to reload his weapon. There were no words. The Frenchman thrust with his bayonet, but the Spaniard was faster than he appeared. He dodged the thrust and hit François in the head with the stock of his unloaded musket. The world exploded in stars for the French soldier. He fell to his knees stunned, feeling warm blood run down his face. The Spaniard raised his weapon for a second blow that would have crushed François' skull. But then another French rifleman appeared, one who had followed François in the climb, and fired his musket at point-blank range. The Spanish guerrilla fighter fell without a sound, with a hole the size of a fist in his back. The battle in the heights became a bloody chaos of hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets against knives, musket stocks against blunderbusses used as clubs, punches, kicks, bites.
Men fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. The smoke from the burned gunpowder was so dense that one could barely see 2 meters away. El Empecinado recognized the danger immediately. If the French established a foothold in the heights, all his tactical advantage would evaporate. He quickly gathered 20 of his best men, experienced guerrilla fighters who had survived dozens of battles. "We have to push them out. They could not consolidate position," he ordered, while unsheathing his sword, a Spanish cavalry blade he had captured from a French officer in an earlier ambush. Miguel, recovered from the shock of seeing the veteran guerrilla fighter fall at his side, reloaded his blunderbuss with hands that no longer trembled. The adrenaline had been replaced by a cold and deadly calm. He advanced toward where a group of 5 French were trying to establish a defensive position using rocks as a wall. He did not think, did not feel fear. He simply acted with the lethal efficiency of a predator. Critical decisions followed in rapid succession. Sergeant Beaufort understood that the men who had reached the heights could not hold out alone. They needed reinforcements or they would die there. But sending more men meant weakening the defense of the main road. It was a tactical dilemma with no correct answer. He chose a compromise. He sent small groups of 5 men to climb at different points, hoping to divide the Spanish attention. François fought for his life against 2 guerrilla fighters simultaneously. His bayonet had penetrated the abdomen of one, but the weapon was stuck in the Spaniard's ribs. While he tried to free it, the second guerrilla fighter lunged at him with a knife. François released the musket and grabbed his attacker's wrist with both hands. They rolled on the ground, each desperately trying to gain control of the blade. The Spanish guerrilla fighter was stronger, but François was more desperate. His hand slipped with the blood that covered both bodies. The knife approached inexorably towards his throat. François could see the bloodshot eyes of his opponent, the pure hatred that burned in them. He was going to die on this rock, 1,000 kilometers from his home, without even knowing if his son had survived the fevers. Then a shot sounded, and the guerrilla fighter collapsed on top of François. Another French soldier had arrived and had saved his life. François pushed the corpse off and stood up, breathing in ragged gasps. He was covered in blood from head to toe. Most of it was not his. He recovered his musket, freed the bayonet from the first Spaniard's body with a brutal pull, and searched for the next enemy. Heroism in this battle did not belong to one side in particular. Both sides fought with desperate courage. A Spanish guerrilla fighter named Pedro, who had been a blacksmith before the war, continued fighting with one arm shattered by a bullet, using his blacksmith's hammer as a deadly weapon. A French rifleman named Antoine covered the retreat of his wounded comrades, despite having 3 bullets lodged in his body, firing methodically until he collapsed from blood loss. The most notable sacrifice was made by Lieutenant Moreau, who, despite his shattered shoulder and barely able to stand, organized a group of wounded riflemen in a defensive position that protected the most seriously wounded. When the Spanish guerrilla fighters tried to flank that position, Moreau led a suicidal bayonet charge that drove them back, although it cost him his life. He fell with 5 wounds but had saved 20 men.
The immediate consequences of these close combats were devastating for both sides. The French had lost almost 70 men killed and another 30 seriously wounded. The Spanish guerrilla fighters, who initially had suffered minimal casualties thanks to their protected positions, now counted 40 dead and numerous wounded. The casualty ratio had changed dramatically, but more importantly, the psychological balance of the battle had changed. The French, initially paralyzed by the shock of the ambush, had recovered their fighting spirit. The Spanish, accustomed to firing from safe positions, now faced an equal fight. The final outcome was no longer determined. The most intense moment of the entire battle arrived when Francois reached the position where El Empecinado personally directed the defense against the French who had reached the heights. The guerrilla leader stood on an elevated rock, completely exposed, shouting orders and firing his pistol toward the French soldiers who were trying to establish positions. His figure had become the symbol of Spanish resistance, and Francois understood instinctively that if that man fell, the entire guerrilla defense might collapse. The French rifleman knelt behind a rock. He rested his musket on the irregular surface to stabilize his aim and carefully aimed toward El Empecinado. The distance was approximately 50 meters, a difficult but feasible shot. Francois breathed deeply, calculated the wind that blew from west to east, slightly adjusted his aim to compensate. His finger began to squeeze the trigger. Miguel saw the danger from his position. The Frenchman was completely concentrated on his target and had not noticed the Spanish guerrilla fighter approaching from his right flank. He could not fire without alerting the Frenchman, who could shoot El Empecinado before dying. So he made an instant decision. He dropped his blunderbuss and launched in a silent run towards Francois. The French shot roared at the same instant that Miguel impacted Francois with all the force of his body. The bullet passed, grazing El Empecinado's head, so close that the guerrilla leader felt the displacement of air. Francois and Miguel rolled on the ground, fighting with animal fury. They hit each other, bit each other, tried to strangle each other. The resolution of that personal combat arrived when another guerrilla fighter, running to help Miguel, slipped in blood and fell heavily on both combatants. In the confusion, Francois managed to free himself and rolled toward a defensive position, but he did not reload his weapon or try to fire again.
Something in the eyes of the Spaniard who had risked his life to save his leader had deeply impacted him. For the first time since the battle began, Francois saw the guerrilla fighters not as abstract enemies, but as men defending their home. The outcome of the battle was decided not by a singular heroic moment, but by the gradual accumulation of Spanish tactical advantages. The French had fought with extraordinary courage, but faced insurmountable problems. Their ammunition was running out quickly after 2 hours of intense combat. The wounded, who now totaled more than 50 men, needed medical attention they could not receive in the middle of the narrow pass. The midday sun heated the rocks, and the French soldiers, loaded with thick wool uniforms, suffered severe dehydration. Sergeant Beaufort, now the highest-ranking officer surviving, faced the most difficult decision of his military career. He could continue fighting until the last man fell, fulfilling the French military code of honor that demanded fighting to the death before surrendering, or he could try to negotiate a retreat that would save the lives of the surviving soldiers, although that meant a humiliation that would ruin his career. Beaufort chose the lives of his men. He ordered a white shirt tied to a bayonet to be raised. The Spanish fire gradually decreased until it ceased completely. A strange silence descended upon the narrow pass, interrupted only by the moans of the wounded and the sound of the wind among the rocks. It was a silence heavier than the roar of battle. El Empecinado personally descended from the heights to negotiate. His face was covered with gunpowder and dried blood, but his eyes shined with the satisfaction of victory. Beaufort waited for him in the middle of the road, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades. The conversation was brief and pragmatic, conducted in broken French that both men barely mastered. The terms were clear. The French would surrender all their weapons and ammunition. The wounded who could walk would be free to return to Madrid with a message. Those who could not walk would receive basic medical attention from the guerrilla fighters. The surviving officers, including Beaufort, would be held as hostages for possible future exchanges. It was a total defeat, but not an extermination. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Narrow Pass extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The French had lost 200 men from an elite regiment, but more importantly, they had lost the illusion of security on Spanish roads. News of the ambush spread quickly throughout the occupation army.
French columns began to demand larger escorts, which further dispersed their already overloaded forces. At this point in the battle, and before explaining the final consequences of this operation, let's build a community. Where are you from? Spain, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, or somewhere else? Share your thoughts about this historical battle. If you appreciate this content, support us with a subscription. Let's continue with the dramatic consequences. Francois was one of the 30 friends released that afternoon. He walked toward Madrid with other survivors, without weapons, without equipment, some barefoot. The 3-day march to the capital was a nightmare of hunger and thirst. Spanish peasants watched them pass with eyes full of hatred or satisfaction. Children threw stones at them, but they were alive. The military analysis of the Battle of the Narrow Pass revealed crucial lessons about irregular warfare. El Empecinado had demonstrated that tactical superiority and knowledge of terrain could overcome advantages in training and equipment. The French learned that their military doctrines, perfected on the battlefields of Central Europe, needed radical adaptation for the war in Spain. French General Jean de Soult, commander of forces in the region, received the report of the defeat with bitter frustration. He ordered reprisals against nearby villages suspected of supporting the guerrilla fighters, which only strengthened popular support for the resistance. It was a vicious circle that the French would never manage to break during the remaining 6 years of the war. For the Spanish guerrilla fighters, the victory represented validation of their methods and an enormous moral boost. El Empecinado became a living legend. His name was pronounced with reverence in taverns from Galicia to Andalusia. More men joined the guerrilla groups inspired by the example of the Narrow Pass. The historical impact of the Battle of the Narrow Pass far transcended its immediate tactical results and became a defining moment in the Spanish War of Independence. Military historians later would study this encounter as a perfect example of how an irregular force, numerically inferior and technically less equipped, could defeat professional troops through intelligent use of terrain, surprise, and deep knowledge of the enemy's limitations. El Empecinado's victory in April 1811 came at a critical moment in the war.
The regular Spanish armies had suffered devastating defeats. The main cities were occupied, and King Joseph Bonaparte nominally controlled all Spanish territory. But battles like this demonstrated that French territorial control was a fragile illusion. The invaders dominated the cities and main roads during the day, but the countryside belonged to the guerrilla fighters, especially during the night. The lessons learned from this combat influenced the development of modern irregular warfare. The concept of guerrilla warfare as a military term originated precisely in Spain during this conflict. British military observers, particularly those serving with the Duke of Wellington's army on the Iberian Peninsula, studied Spanish guerrilla tactics and incorporated them into their own military doctrines. These lessons would later travel to the American colonies, to the Latin American independence wars, and eventually to conflicts of the 20th century. Francois finally returned to France in 1814 after the Napoleonic defeat and the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war. He reunited with his wife and his son, who was now 9 years old, and looked at him with the distant curiosity reserved for strangers. Nightmares of the Battle of the Narrow Pass tormented him for the rest of his life. Every night he relived the moment when the Spanish knife approached his throat, the sound of men dying, the smell of gunpowder and blood. He never spoke of the war with his family. Some experiences were too dark to share. Miguel continued fighting with El Empecinado until the end of the war. He survived dozens of later battles, always on the front line, always risking his life for Spain's freedom. When Ferdinand VII returned to the Spanish throne in 1814, Miguel expected rewards in recognition for his sacrifices. Instead, the absolutist king distrusted the guerrilla fighters, seeing them as potentially revolutionary elements. Many, including El Empecinado himself, would be persecuted in later years by the government they had helped restore. The historical irony was bitter. The memory of the battle was preserved in contradictory ways. In France, it became an example of the difficulties of the war in Spain, mentioned in military memoirs as a warning about the dangers of tactical complacency. In Spain, it entered the pantheon of glorious victories against foreign invaders.
celebrated in popular songs, oral stories, and eventually in history books. Commemorative monuments would arrive much later. In the 20th century, near the site of the narrow pass, a modest plaque was erected commemorating the battle. It does not mention the names of individual combatants, neither French nor Spanish. It simply records the date and the result. Here, men of Spain defended their freedom. April 1811. It is an appropriately sober monument for a battle that, like all battles, was both glorious and tragic. The tactical lessons of the Battle of the Narrow Pass influenced military thinkers for generations. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist, studied the Peninsular War extensively and concluded that popular war, what he called people's war, could be a decisive force when combined with regular military operations. The Spanish guerrilla fighter became a military archetype studied in academies around the world. To fully understand the legacy of this battle, we must recognize that it represented something more than a tactical victory. It demonstrated that the determination of a people defending their land could overcome apparently insurmountable material advantages. The Spanish guerrilla fighters did not have the elegant uniforms, systematic training, or logistical support of the French army, but they had something the invaders could never equal. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their right to self-determination. Captain Henri Dubois survived his wounds against all odds. He spent 3 months recovering in an improvised hospital in Madrid before being evacuated to France. The wounds in his chest never healed completely. He would suffer chronic pain for the rest of his life. He was discharged from the army with a small pension and returned to his hometown in Provence. He opened a small shop and never spoke again of his experiences in Spain. On his deathbed in 1847, his last words were in Spanish, "Forgive me." No one knew whom he was asking forgiveness from. The Battle of the Narrow Pass of April 1811 became a microcosm of the entire Spanish War of Independence. It showed the clash between two ways of making war: the traditional European way, with its established rules, ordered formations, and decisive field battles, and irregular warfare, fluid, brutal, and ruthless. The outcome of that specific clash and of the broader war demonstrated that the future of war would not belong only to large regular armies. The thoughtful conclusion about this battle must recognize its moral ambiguity. There was no clean victory, no heroes without stain. There were ordinary men, both French and Spanish, thrown into extraordinary circumstances. Some acted with courage, others with cruelty. Most simply tried to survive. History remembers them collectively, but each one was an individual with hopes, fears, families, and dreams that war destroyed or irrevocably transformed. The narrow pass where the battle occurred remains practically unchanged today. Tourists occasionally pass through it without knowing the blood that soaked those rots more than 2 centuries ago. The wind still blows through the heights, moving the same rosemary bushes. History continues, but the echoes of that April day remain, whispering lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the terrible human cost of all armed conflicts.